Hey everybody, thanks for joining me today. You know, during his ministry on earth, one of the things that Jesus consistently did was he violated people's expectations of what he should do. And in doing so, he actually offended them. You know, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree because his father was good at doing the same thing. Do you remember the Old Testament story of Naaman in 2 Kings 5? He was a high-ranking general who had contracted leprosy. And he sends word to the prophet Elijah asking him to come and pray for him to be healed. But instead, Elijah sends his servant to instruct Naaman to dip himself in the muddy, dirty waters of the Jordan River 7 times, and he will be healed. Now, Naaman is immediately offended on multiple fronts because God's plan violated his expectations. He expected Elijah to have the courtesy of showing up to pray for him personally. But instead, he sends his lowly servant with what appears to be a degrading response. Go wash in the dirty Jordan. Naaman is upset. He's offended with God. And he's offended with Elijah that they didn't do what he expected them to do. In fact, he refused to do it at first until his servant talks sense into him. Because Naaman is filled with pride and arrogance and the need to have it his way. In John 9:6-7, it says, having said this, Jesus spit on the ground, made some mud with his saliva, put it on the man's eyes, and said, go wash in the pool of Siloam. In this story, what Jesus did was gross, but the blind man did what he was told immediately because he humbled himself. He was willing to do what Jesus told him to do without being offended, without getting upset, even though it didn't match his expectations. You know, if we're not careful, our expectations will hinder the move of God in our life and in our church. Because when God doesn't move in the way we want him to move, or he does something that doesn't make sense to us, we can get offended. We can get upset with God the way Naaman was, and we can miss our destiny, our moment. The truth of the matter is that Jesus is not subject to our expectation of him. We are subject to his expectation of us. Why doesn't he clearly reveal himself to me, we ask? Why does he often leave me guessing about who he is and what he's doing? We all have expectations about God and what he could do and should do. And we can become frustrated and disillusioned and offended when we don't see him behaving like we think he should. Over the years, I've had my questions about things that God has done. Many years ago, one of my board members lost his 19-year-old daughter in a tragic car accident while she was on her way home for Christmas break. Then 6 months later, his wife was diagnosed with cancer, and within that same year, she too was dead. And I remember standing at her casket full of questions as a young pastor, questions I couldn't answer about God's behavior, to my board member and his 12-year-old son who had just lost a sister and a mother. Why does God do that? Why doesn't he feel compelled to meet my expectations? After all, he's God. You would think that because he wants everyone to come to him, he would be all about proving who he was and what he could do. So why doesn't he do that? Well, look at his controversial words in John 6:53-4. I tell you the truth, that unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you cannot have eternal life within you. But anyone who eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise that person at the last day. Now, who wouldn't be confused by those words? It goes on to say this, that many of his disciples then said, this is hard to understand, Lord. How can anyone accept this? That day, many of his disciples turned their backs on Jesus. And so he turned to the 12 and he asked them, are you going to leave me too? But Peter replies in verses 68 and 69, Lord, to whom would we go? You alone have the words of eternal life. We believe and we know that you are the Holy One sent by God. Do you see it? Peter says this, in the midst of his questions, we believe and we know that you are the Holy One of God. And I believe what Peter is saying here is this, even though we don't understand what you're doing, even though you aren't meeting our expectations of what we think a Messiah should do and be, even though we can't see your way, we're going to trust you. And I love what he says right before that statement, Lord, where else should we go? Times without number, I have heard Peter's words echoed by others other followers of Jesus in times of disillusionment. Where else can I go? How could we ever walk this road without him? You know, I've come to the conclusion that we cannot compel God to do what we want him to do. He does things in his time and his way, and his way is the way of faith. So when I am offended or disillusioned because God is not meeting my expectations, I have to choose to believe and to trust that his way is good, that his way is the right way. I have to turn my eyes back to the cross and think, how can I question his goodness when he willingly laid down his life for me? You see, Jesus doesn't always work the way I want him to work because he isn't bound by my expectations. But get this, he always works so I can trust him. Well, I hope that blesses and encourages you today. Thanks for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you this Sunday. God bless you.